In 1640, a confederation of indigenous nations in what is now upstate New York launched a series of wars so brutal and so far-reaching that they permanently redrew the map of an entire continent. Historians call it the Beaver Wars. That's technically true, but the prize both sides were killing and dying over was not territory for its own sake. It was the right to sell a single animal's fur to men in Europe who wanted, more than almost anything else, to put a fashionable hat on their heads. That same animal also carries, tucked beneath its tail, a strange oily secretion that ancient physicians swore could cure seizures, and that centuries later would quietly end up inside ice cream, gelatin, and fine French perfume without almost anyone realizing it. But before we get there, we need to go back. Because this story starts in the cold rivers of the Northern Hemisphere, long before Europeans ever crossed the Atlantic, and it takes a long, violent road before it ends. Beavers have been hunted by humans for thousands of years, prized for their thick, waterproof pelts capable of keeping a person warm through brutal winters. But ancient civilizations across Europe and Asia also discovered something stranger inside the animal. Tucked near the base of its tail, beavers carry a pair of glands that produce a thick, waxy substance called castoreum, used by the animal to mark its territory. Ancient Greek and Roman physicians, including Hippocrates himself, believed this secretion had remarkable medicinal properties, prescribing it for headaches, seizures, and a long list of other ailments. For centuries, castoreum sat in apothecary cabinets across Europe and Asia, treated as a strange but valuable medicine extracted from one of the continent's most common fur-bearing animals. Then, sometime in the late medieval period, Europeans discovered something else the beaver could provide, and this discovery would eventually matter far more than any medicine. Beaver fur contains microscopic barbs on its underlying fibers that, when processed correctly, mat together into an exceptionally dense, durable, waterproof felt, far superior to wool or any other material available at the time. By the 1500s, hats made from this felt had become a status symbol across European society, and demand exploded across every social class wealthy enough to afford one. And that demand is worth remembering, because it was about to drive an entire continent's beaver population to the edge of extinction and force European powers to look across an ocean for a fresh supply. By the late 1500s, centuries of relentless hunting had wiped out beaver populations across most of Western Europe, leaving hat makers desperate for a new source. They found one in North America, where French explorers and fishermen working the cod banks off Newfoundland discovered that indigenous trading partners had access to staggering numbers of beaver pelts, taken from rivers and forests that, by European standards, seemed almost limitlessly stocked with the animal. French traders began exchanging metal tools, cloth, and firearms for furs along the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers, and within decades this casual exchange had become the economic backbone of an entire colonial enterprise. In 1670, England's King Charles II granted a royal charter to a new trading company, giving it a monopoly over an enormous watershed draining into Hudson Bay, an area covering roughly 4 million square kilometers, more than 40% of what would eventually become Canada. That company called itself the Hudson's Bay Company, and that name is worth remembering, because it was about to become one of the most powerful commercial forces ever to operate in North America, controlling trade across territory larger than most countries on Earth, built entirely around a single animal's pelt. The company developed its own currency built directly around the trade itself, an accounting unit called the made beaver, representing the value of one prime adult pelt. A musket might cost 12 made beaver, a wool blanket 6. For nearly 2 centuries, an animal's fur quite literally functioned as money across an entire region of the continent. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. The fur trade was far too valuable for any single power to control quietly, and competing claims to the best hunting territories collided almost immediately. The Iroquois Confederacy, having already hunted beaver populations near their own territory close to depletion, needed fresh hunting grounds to keep supplying European traders and maintain the flow of firearms and goods they had come to depend on. Standing between them and the richer beaver territories to the west were rival nations allied with French traders, especially the Huron Confederacy, who controlled access to fur-rich regions around the Great Lakes. Beginning in the 1640s, the Iroquois launched a sustained military campaign against the Huron and their allies, fueled by Dutch and English firearms traded in exchange for pelts. The violence was staggering in scale. Iroquois forces effectively destroyed Huron society as a political entity within a few short years, killing thousands, scattering survivors across the continent, and absorbing or displacing tribe after tribe across the Great Lakes and Ohio country in the decades that followed. The conflict, fought intermittently for roughly 60 years, came to be known as the Beaver Wars, and by the time a fragile peace was finally signed in 1701, the political map of an enormous swath of North America had been violently and permanently rearranged, almost entirely because of a fashion accessory worn 6,000 kilometers away in European cities most of the combatants would never see. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. European fashion did not just happen to benefit from access to North American fur. It actively financed and drove a war that reshaped the political destiny of an entire continent, and the beaver hat itself was hiding a second, much quieter danger that would not become clear for generations. Making felt from beaver fur required a chemical trick. Hat makers discovered that treating the raw pelt with a solution containing mercury caused the fur's outer fibers to mat together far more easily, a process workers called carroting, because it left the treated fur with a distinctive orange tint. The technique worked beautifully. It also meant that hatters spent years of their working lives breathing in mercury vapor inside small, poorly ventilated workshops, day after day, with no understanding of what it was doing to their bodies. The symptoms crept in slowly: tremors in the hands, slurred speech, mood swings, irritability, and eventually, in the most severe cases, hallucinations and a kind of twitching, stumbling gait that made affected hatters look, to outside observers, almost perpetually drunk. In Danbury, Connecticut, where hat making became a major regional industry, the condition was so common locals gave it its own nickname, the Danbury Shakes. By the 1830s, the phrase "mad as a hatter" had entered everyday English to describe anyone behaving erratically, decades before Lewis Carroll borrowed it for a fictional character in Alice in Wonderland. For more than a century, an entire profession quietly poisoned itself to manufacture a fashion item that wealthy customers wore without the faintest idea what had gone into making it. Mercury was not removed from American hat making until 1941. The beaver population paid an even steeper price. By the 1820s, hunting pressure across North America had driven beaver numbers so low that the Hudson's Bay Company, worried about the long-term survival of its own business, introduced some of the earliest conservation measures in North American history, deliberately limiting how many pelts could be taken from certain territories. What ultimately rescued the species, though, was not careful management. It was a sudden, almost arbitrary shift in European taste. Around the end of the 1830s, fashionable Europeans, led in part by figures like Prince Albert, began favoring hats made of silk instead of felted beaver fur. Within a remarkably short span of years, demand for beaver pelts collapsed, the centuries-old trade that had financed wars and built companies practically evaporating, because wealthy men decided they preferred a different fabric on their heads. There is a strange final twist to this story that almost nobody connects to any of it. That same castoreum gland the ancient Greeks once prescribed as medicine never fully disappeared from human use. In the early 20th century, flavor chemists, borrowing techniques from the perfume industry, discovered that castoreum's musky, faintly fruity scent could enhance and round out vanilla, strawberry, and raspberry flavorings. By the 1960s, it was being quietly blended into ice cream, gelatin, chewing gum, and fruit-flavored drinks across the food industry. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration classifies castoreum as a natural flavoring, which under labeling law means manufacturers are not required to spell out exactly what that phrase refers to on an ingredient list. The substance is harvested today by anesthetizing a beaver and carefully milking its glands. An expensive, labor-intensive process that means genuine castoreum has become exceedingly rare in modern mass-produced food, though it remains, to this day, a legally approved ingredient sitting quietly inside that vague, natural flavoring category so many products carry. A felt hat financed an empire's trading company. A war was fought between nations whose own people had never seen the customers driving the demand. A profession was poisoned slowly by the very chemical that made its product possible. A species was hunted nearly to extinction, and it was saved not by conservation, but by a sudden shift in fashion. And a strange glandular secretion, once prescribed as ancient medicine, may still be quietly hiding inside the vanilla ice cream sitting in your freezer right now, disguised behind two unassuming words on the label: natural flavoring. It is worth sitting with how much of this trade depended on people never fully understanding what they were buying. European customers wearing felt hats had no idea their fashion choice was financing a war between nations on a continent they would never visit. Hatters going slowly mad from mercury poisoning had no idea the very chemical that gave their product its quality was the thing unraveling their minds. And today, almost nobody scooping a spoonful of vanilla ice cream out of the freezer has any idea that the substance rounding out its flavor might trace back to a gland once prized by ancient physicians as medicine. The beaver trade did not just build an economy and reshape a continent. It quietly normalized a pattern that still holds today, where the true cost and the true contents of what we consume are kept just vague enough that most people never think to ask. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things. We have got a lot more coming.